Hello there, my dreamy travelers. Tonight, we follow a different kind of silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence. Of a love so afraid of itself that it disappeared rather than risk causing harm. This is the story of New Moon. Told from inside the darkness Edward Cullen carried with him when he walked away. The same story you know, but seen through eyes that never stop watching, through a mind that heard every thought, but the one that mattered most. I'm trying my best to make these videos with my whole heart, and sometimes I doubt if it's really worth all the effort. But your comments make me feel seen and remind me why I'm doing this. I'm hoping to reach 1,000 subscribers soon. I'm close, but not there yet. If you'd like to support a small creator and this little community we're building, please consider subscribing. Thank you. So, close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the longest absence begin. Time moves differently when you cannot age. Edward had understood this in an abstract sense for nearly a century, had watched decades blur past, while his own face remained unchanged, while the world transformed around him, and he stayed fixed in place like a stone in a moving river. He had made peace with it, or something close enough to peace that it served the same function. He had learned not to count the years, not to measure himself against the passage of time that governed everyone else. But then came Bella Swan, and time began to matter again, not in the abstract way of calendars and seasons, but in the specific, urgent way of a clock you cannot stop watching, because what it is counting down to frightens you. She was turning 18. It was a fact so ordinary, so human, so entirely unremarkable in any other context that Edward could not explain to himself why it settled in his chest like a stone he had swallowed. Humans turned 18 every day. Every hour, somewhere in the world, someone crossed that threshold with celebration and relief, and the particular joy of a number that carried significance. It was nothing. It was everything. Because he would not turn 18. He had not turned 18 in nearly 90 years, and would not turn 18 in 90 more, in 900 more, in any number of years that could be reasonably imagined. He was 17 forever, fixed at the precise moment Carlyle had found him burning with influenza and remade him into something that could not progress. And Bella was human and warm and entirely beautifully mortal, would move forward without him. 1 year older, then 2, then 10, then all the decades he could not follow her through. He had not let himself think about this directly before. He had kept the thought at a careful distance, acknowledging its shape without examining its details, the way one might acknowledge a cliff's edge without looking down. But her birthday forced the examination. She was stepping across a line he had already crossed in the wrong direction, and the symbolism of it would not leave him alone. Alice had organized the party with the particular intensity she brought to everything she envisioned, her small hands arranging and rearranging the details of the evening with a focus that bordered on reverence. Flowers, candles, a cake Bella would not want them to make a fuss over, but that Alice had made anyway, layered and beautiful, and exactly the kind of gesture that Bella received with gracious discomfort. Edward had watched his sister's preparations with a divided heart, genuinely grateful for Alice's love of Bella, while simultaneously wishing the evening did not have to exist. He had said nothing. He had smiled when Alice showed him her plans and had agreed that yes, Bella deserved to be celebrated, and had kept the stone in his chest to himself. The evening of the party, Edward drove to Charlie's house with a familiar awareness of how deeply familiar this drive had become. He knew every turn, every cracked edge of pavement, every tree that marked the route between his family's house and hers. He knew the way the light fell through the cab of his car at this hour, knew the exact sound the tires made on the gravel of Charlie's driveway, knew the rhythm of 2 heartbeats inside that small house before he was close enough for most ears to detect them. Charlie's thoughts as Edward knocked were predictably layered. The surface cooperation of a man who had accepted, with some resignation, that his daughter's boyfriend was a fixture now, and beneath that the persistent, unspecified unease that Charlie Swan carried whenever Edward was in proximity. He could never articulate what bothered him, and Edward had long since learned to read the particular quality of Charlie's suspicion. Not pointed, not close to any real understanding, just the trained instinct of a man who had spent decades assessing people for a living, registering that something did not quite add up. Edward managed it with practiced ease, meeting Charlie's eyes with the careful warmth he had learned to perform convincingly, accepting the implicit terms of Charlie's tolerance without requiring anything to be spoken aloud. Bella was beautiful, as she always was, and as she always seemed entirely unaware of being. She had dressed simply, her dark hair loose, her expression carrying the particular tension of someone who had been talked into an evening they hadn't asked for, but was trying to receive graciously. Edward heard her heartbeat change slightly when she saw him, the small involuntary acceleration that still, after months of standing beside her, made something in his chest tighten with a feeling he had no adequate word for. She was 1 year older than she had been yesterday. He was the same as he had always been, and always would be. He held that thought at a careful distance during the drive to the Cullen house. His family was assembled in a way that fell somewhere between a genuine welcome and a careful performance, and Edward was perhaps the only one present who could hear the full complexity of what each of them was actually feeling beneath the decorative lights and the arranged smiles. Alice was genuinely joyful, her thoughts bright with love for Bella and satisfaction that her vision of the evening was becoming real. Esme's warmth was unperformed and absolute, her maternal feeling for Bella having grown steadily over the months until it had become something she didn't question. Carlyle was present and kind, his thoughts running the steady background frequencies of a man who was always assessing, always attending to others. And then there was Jasper. Edward kept part of his attention on Jasper through the entire arrival, through the opening pleasantries and the candles and the small talk that people generated because silence made them uncomfortable. Jasper stood at a calculated distance, his posture relaxed in the way of someone who had trained their body to appear relaxed regardless of what was happening internally, and Edward could hear what that careful arrangement cost him. The thirst was always harder for Jasper. This was not a secret or a shame. It was simply a fact of his history, the decades he had spent before Carlisle's family in a world where feeding was unrestricted, where the constant stimulation of human blood had been his entire existence. He had come further than anyone gave him credit for, further than Edward sometimes acknowledged when jealousy or frustration briefly narrowed his perspective. But the cost was evident tonight in the careful quality of his stillness, in the way his thoughts moved, in the disciplined patterns of someone managing a constant interior negotiation. Bella was unaware of this. She moved through the room with the particular warmth she brought to any space she occupied, accepting Esme's embrace, exchanging a smile with Emmett, allowing Alice to maneuver her toward the table of gifts with the resigned affection of someone who had learned that arguing with Alice was rarely worth the effort. And then the paper tore. He heard it before he processed it. The small, incidental sound of a gift's wrapping giving way too quickly. The tiny resistance of paper against skin giving way not quite cleanly. Such an ordinary sound. The kind of sound that happened 100 times a day in any house, unremarkable and instantly forgotten. The blood reached the air. Edward's awareness split into two tracks simultaneously. The first was his own body's response, the thirst igniting in his throat with the automatic, impersonal efficiency of a reflex. The predator beneath his civilized architecture registering the scent and generating its own cold mathematics of proximity and opportunity before his conscious mind could form a rejection. He had spent months near Bella, had built his tolerance to her particular blood with the accumulated discipline of daily choice. But the open air was different from the controlled proximity of sitting beside her. This was blood freely flowing, uncontained, and his body knew the difference even when he did not want it to. The second track was Jasper. He felt it through Jasper's mind a fraction of a second before it became visible. The sharp crack of control giving way, the months of careful management undone in the span of a single inhaled breath, the hunger rising through Jasper's discipline, the way water rises through cracking stone, not dramatically, not all at once, but inevitably, following every available path toward the surface. Jasper moved. Edward moved faster. What he did, he would spend days afterward returning to, with a particular horror of an act he could not undo or justify. He flung Bella backward, away from Jasper, away from the blood and the danger and the moment that was already happening beyond his ability to stop it cleanly. He flung her with the instinctive force of someone moving at vampire speed to intercept vampire danger, which meant he flung her with far more force than a human being should ever be subjected to by someone who claimed to care for her. She struck the table. He heard the collision, heard the glass going over, heard the sounds of her fall translated through the brutal accuracy of his enhanced perception into a complete inventory of every moment of impact. He heard her sharp intake of breath and the immediate change in her heartbeat and the specific quality of her pain before he could even turn to see what he had done. She was bleeding more now than she had been before he intervened. The room changed. The scent was stronger, and the vampires in it responded to that fact with the unified physical shift of a group of people leaning away from a fire that has suddenly grown. Carlisle toward Bella, with his physician's focus overriding everything else, his thoughts already in triage mode, assessing damage and prioritizing. Esme guided Jasper backward toward the door with quiet urgency. Emmett positioned himself with the casual deliberateness of someone placing their body between two things that should not get closer to each other. Rosalie stood at the far edge of the room, her thoughts cool and controlled, the emotion beneath them complex enough that Edward did not look at it directly. Her relationship to scenes like this one was his own kind of wound. Edward removed himself from the room where Bella was bleeding because there was nothing he could do there that was more important than not being a second source of danger. He stood in the adjacent space and listened to Carlisle's steady voice and the sound of Bella's breathing and the diminishing pace of the crisis returning to something that could be managed. And he told himself this was the correct decision, the controlled decision, the decision of someone who knew his own limits. He stayed long enough to understand she was going to be all right. And then the part of him that had been forming a decision for weeks, the part that had been building its argument in the silent hours of the night while Bella slept, and he sat in the corner of her room watching the rise and fall of her chest. That part understood that the argument was now complete. He drove her home afterward with the particular attentiveness of someone paying close attention to something they know they are seeing for the last time. She talked in the way she talked when she was trying to minimize something that had frightened her, making the evening smaller, framing what had happened as manageable and ordinary, and not the evidence of structural impossibility that Edward's mind had already finished cataloguing. He listened to her voice. He watched the road. He had already begun, though he had not yet said so to anyone, to say goodbye. The decision did not arrive all at once. That was the thing Edward would remember afterward, in the long months that followed, that it hadn't been a single moment of clarity or resolution, but rather an accumulation, a slow filling of a vessel that had been filling for longer than he had admitted to himself. The birthday party had not created the decision. It had only revealed that the decision had already been made, somewhere in the quiet architecture of his reasoning, while he had been busy pretending otherwise. He gave himself 3 days. 3 days of sitting with what he knew, of examining it from every angle his century of existence had taught him to examine things from, of looking for the argument that would undo it. He was thorough. He was honest. He applied to the question of leaving Bella the same relentless logic he had applied to every difficult decision in his long life. And at the end of 3 days, he arrived at the same place he had started, which told him everything he needed to know. Carlisle listened without interrupting. This was one of the things Edward had always valued most about his maker and father, the quality of his attention, the way he could receive difficult information without immediately moving to reshape it into something more comfortable. Edward laid out his reasoning on the second evening, sitting in Carlisle's study, while the rain moved across the windows in the particular rhythm that defined Forks through every season, and Carlisle sat across from him and listened to everything. When Edward finished, Carlisle was quiet for a long moment. He did not agree. Edward heard this in his thoughts before he heard it in his words. The careful disagreement of a man who respected both the reasoning and the person presenting it too much to dismiss either, but who had arrived at a different conclusion. Carlyle believed that love was not made safer by removal, that danger shared was not doubled but halved, that Bella Swan had demonstrated a capacity for navigating their world that deserved more credit than Edward's plan afforded her. He said all of this. He said it gently and with complete sincerity, and without any of the accusations he could have made and chose not to. He pointed out that Edward was making a decision for two people while consulting only one of them. He pointed out that Bella's own assessment of the risk she was willing to accept had been consistently clear, and that choosing not to honor that assessment required a certainty about knowing better than she did that Edward might want to examine carefully. Edward heard every word. He held each, spun and turned it over and felt its weight, and understood that Carlyle was not wrong in the way that people are wrong when they have missed something. Carlyle was right in the way that a different set of values produces a different correct answer, and the two answers could not both be followed. He had already chosen which answer he was following. The hardest part was Alice. He had not gone to her directly. He had not needed to. Alice's visions operated on their own schedule, and she had seen enough of what Edward was planning to appear in the doorway of his room on the third morning with an expression that he rarely saw on her face, and that he understood immediately to be grief. She did not try to stop him with arguments. She knew better, after the decades they had spent as siblings, than to believe that arguing would reach him once he had reasoned himself to a position. Instead, she sat on the floor of his room, not in a chair, on the floor, a deliberate smallness, and she showed him what she had seen. He read it in her mind before she could have put it into words. The future she had glimpsed for Bella in the months that would follow his leaving. The specific quality of it, the greyness and the stillness, the way her visions of Bella became increasingly indistinct, not because Bella was hard to see, as she so often was, but because Bella would become someone who barely moved through the world, generating fewer and fewer decision points for Alice's gift to track. Edward sat with this for a long time. Then he said, quietly, that he had seen it, and that he was proceeding anyway, and he watched something shift in Alice's expression that he would carry with him for a long time afterward. She asked him one question. She asked whether he had considered that his certainty about what was best for Bella was itself a form of the arrogance he accused himself of when he called himself a monster. Whether removing a person's choices in order to protect them was an act of love or something that only resembled it from a sufficient distance. He did not answer her. He was not sure he had an answer. He spent the following day deciding what he would say, the mechanics of it. He had told the truth to Bella exactly once about what he was, standing in the sunlight of a mountain meadow, while she touched his glittering arm with a fearlessness that had undone him from the beginning. He had chosen honesty then because honesty had seemed like the only way to give her a real choice. Now he was choosing something different, and he had to understand why, had to be certain the reasoning was sound and not simply convenient. If he told her the truth, that he was leaving because he loved her, because Jasper had nearly killed her in their home, because every day she spent in the orbit of his family was a day the mathematics of accident and instinct could resolve against her, she would argue. She would apply that quiet, clear-eyed logic she brought to every conflict between them, the logic that never raised its voice and never required volume because it was simply correct. she would find the holes in his reasoning, and there were holes, and she would stand in them and refuse to move, and he would not be able to leave. If he told her it was over because he did not want her anymore, because she had simply ceased to be something he wanted to maintain, because his kind did not sustain these attachments with the permanence that humans gave them, she would be devastated in a way that was clean. It would hurt in the acute, defined way of something that had an edge to it, something that could be identified and grieved and eventually set down. And she would not wait for him. She would not spend years watching the tree line for his return, or holding herself in suspension against the possibility that he was wrong. She would mourn, and then she would move, and she would build a life that had no space in it for what they had been. He was choosing the cruelest thing, because it was, by his reasoning, the most merciful one. He spent a long time alone with the full honesty of that sentence before he allowed himself to continue. He called Alice the morning of the day he had chosen, and told her to say goodbye to Bella herself, privately, in whatever way felt true. He heard Alice's silence on the other end of the call. Not the blank silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the specific silence of someone who had too much and was choosing to say none of it. She asked him again if he was certain. He said that he was. She said goodbye in a voice he had not heard from her in decades, and the call ended. He found Bella on a walk near her house. He had known where she would be, not through any vision, but through the accumulated knowledge of months of close attention, the way her patterns had become familiar to him, the routes she chose when she needed air, and the particular hour of the day she chose them. He fell into step at a distance first, watching her from the tree line for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, recording the specific quality of her movement, the slight heaviness in her step that had appeared after the birthday party, and that she probably didn't know was visible to someone watching carefully. When he stepped into her path, she turned to face him, and her expression in that first unguarded instant was the one she always wore when she saw him, the one she had never quite managed to conceal, the undefended relief of someone who did not know how to hide being glad. He memorized it. He filed it alongside every other thing he had memorized about her. The exact rhythm of her heartbeat at rest, the particular quality of the silence where her thoughts should be, the way she tilted her head slightly when she was listening carefully to something. He memorized it because he was aware with a cold and absolute clarity that he was about to erase it. He told her he was leaving. He said the words plainly, without preamble, because preamble would have given her time to form a response, and he needed to reach the end of the necessary sentences before she could interrupt the architecture he had built. He told her that his kind did not belong in the human world, that this had been a distraction, a human moment of weakness that his kind was sometimes vulnerable to, but that did not last. He told her she was not good for him. He told her, and this was the sentence that cost him the most, that she had never been good for him, that what he had felt was something less substantial than she had believed it to be, something that had served its purpose and had now run its course. He did not look at her eyes while he said it. He looked past her with the deliberate vacancy of someone performing disinterest, because if he had looked at her eyes, he would not have been able to finish. She asked him if he was serious. He said that he was. She stood very still. He could hear her heartbeat, and the change in it was something he would carry with him for a long time. The specific sound of a rhythm that had been steady and warm altering under the weight of something being removed from it. It was not dramatic. That was the worst part. It was quiet, the way genuine damage often is, the body understanding before the mind has finished processing. She said his name, just his name once, without inflection, as if testing whether he was still the person who answered to it. He told her to take care of herself. He said it with a kind of practiced neutrality that required him to be very far away from himself, to operate from a distance that felt, for one terrible moment, like the exact distance he had accused himself of maintaining from his own nature in all the worst years of his life. Then she folded, not all at once, not with any sound, just a slow yielding of the structure that had been holding her upright, her knees finding the ground in the way of a body that has been asked to hold something it was not built to hold. He was beside her before she could finish falling, his arms around her out of an instinct that overrode everything he had just said, everything he had just done. He held her for a moment that was longer than it should have been if he meant what he had said. Then he picked her up, carried her through the trees to the edge of her father's property, to a place where Charlie would find her when he came looking, which Edward knew Charlie would do because he had already heard Charlie's thoughts turning toward concern from the direction of the house. He set her down with a care that was more honest than anything he had said to her in the last 10 minutes, settling her gently against the base of a tree, brushing her hair back from her face with a single gesture he allowed himself, because he was already leaving and it could not make anything worse. She did not respond. Her eyes were open and she was breathing and her heart was beating and she was alive. And these facts had to be enough because they were all he was permitted to take with him. He ran. He ran until Fawkes was behind him, and the sound of her heartbeat was no longer detectable even by his senses, and the silence that replaced it was the loudest thing he had ever heard. He went south first. There was no particular reason for south over any other direction, except that south meant distance, and distance was the only thing that felt like a viable response to what he had just done. He moved through the forests of Oregon and then California, and then further, crossing into Mexico, in the particular way that vampires cross borders, without documentation, without checkpoints, following the wilderness corridors that existed between human settlements like a parallel geography invisible to anyone who could not move at his speed or sustain his endurance. He ran through the Sierra Madre with the mountains rising around him in the dark, through pine forests that gave way to scrub and then to jungle as he moved further south, through the kind of ancient wilderness that asked nothing of its inhabitants except that they survive. He did not think about Bella during the first hours of running. This was not discipline. It was shock, the cognitive equivalent of the body's response to severe injury, a temporary suspension of full processing while the systems that managed overwhelming input found a way to distribute the weight of it. He ran, and he did not think, and the trees went past him in a blur that required no interpretation. And for a few hours the silence in his mind was a different kind of silence than the one he had left behind in Fawkes. It was the silence of velocity, of a body moving faster than thought could follow, and he chased it south through the dark hours of the night until even that relief began to thin. Then the running stopped being sufficient, and the thinking began. He had expected, in some vague way, that he had not examined carefully enough before the fact that removing himself from the source of the problem would produce a corresponding relief, that the constant tension of being near Bella, the thirst, the fear, the vigilance, the daily negotiation between what he was and what he wanted to be, would ease once he was no longer in proximity to her, that the decision, having been made and executed, would settle into something that felt like the right thing from the inside, the way it had seemed like the right thing from the outside. It did not settle. It opened. The relief he had anticipated was not there. In its place was something that had no immediate name, a vast structural absence where the organizing principle of his recent existence had been, the way a load-bearing wall's removal reveals not just the space the wall occupied, but the extent to which everything around it had been held in place by its presence. He had not understood, until he was standing on the other side of it, how much of himself had been organized around her, not just the hours he had spent in her company or at her window or in the biology classroom beside her, but the hours he had spent away from her, which had been organized around her too, structured by the knowledge that he would return, that the next evening existed and would bring him back to that particular silence that belonged only to her. He had removed himself from the source of the danger and discovered too late that he had also removed himself from the only thing that had made the danger feel worth managing. He stayed in South America for several weeks. The continent was vast and wild enough in its interior to provide the hunting and the solitude he needed, and he moved through its forests and mountains with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing necessary maintenance rather than living. He hunted, he existed, he covered distance. He found a river valley in the Venezuelan interior so remote that the only human thoughts within his range were the occasional passing awareness of a settlement a great distance away, faint as radio signals from the edge of a broadcast's reach. And he sat beside the river for 2 days and listened to the water and tried to locate within himself some version of the peace he had been told solitude could provide. The water was loud in the particular way of fast rivers, all percussive complexity and constant motion. He had always been able to find something meditative in natural sound, in the years before Bella, when natural sound was the closest available substitute for genuine quiet. But he found now that the river's noise only underlined what was absent. Every sound that was not her heartbeat was simply not her heartbeat, and there were a great many sounds in the world. The nights were the worst of it, which surprised him. He did not sleep, had not slept in nearly a century, and so nighttime had never previously held any particular meaning for him beyond the practical advantage of darkness for a species that preferred not to be observed. But he had spent months of nights in Bella's room, watching her sleep, inhabiting the specific peace of her silence, while the rest of the world broadcast its contents at him without pause. He had sat in the rocking chair in the corner of her small room and listened to her breathe, and had experienced something he could only describe inadequately as rest. Not the physical rest his body did not require, but the cognitive rest of a mind that had been running at full capacity for nearly a century, finally finding a frequency at which it could simply be still. The nights now were loud in the way that they had been loud before her. populated with the distant thoughts of humans in whatever settlements lay within his range, their dreams and anxieties and half-formed midnight thoughts pressing into his consciousness with the same indiscriminate generosity they always had. He heard a woman in a village several miles distant dreaming about her children. He heard a man closer by working through the arithmetic of a debt he could not resolve, turning the numbers over and over in his sleep as if repetition might change them. He heard the shallow, imagistic thinking of people in the lightest layers of sleep, their minds producing fragments without narrative, sensation without context. He'd forgotten how loud it was, or rather, he had not forgotten. He had simply lived with it for so long before Bella that he had ceased to register it as noise, the way one ceases to register a sound that never stops. She had given him a contrast he had not asked for and had not known he needed, and now he could not unhear the difference between the world with her silence in it and the world without. He was in a city, a large one, coastal, alive with the compressed density of urban human thought that pressed against his consciousness from every direction simultaneously. When he realized he was actively listening for her, not with any conscious intention, not with any expectation of success, simply the way a tongue finds a missing tooth, the involuntary return to an absence, his mind reaching in the direction of the silence that was no longer there and finding instead the ordinary noise of 1,000 other people thinking about 1,000 other things, the woman at the market calculating her change, the taxi driver composing an argument he intended to have later, the child at the window watching rain and thinking nothing in particular, just watching, just being present in the uncomplicated way of children who have not yet learned to fill every moment with intention. None of them were her. He left the city and went back into the wilderness. The family was in Alaska by then. He knew this through Alice, with whom he maintained a minimal and carefully bounded contact, enough to confirm that the family was intact and safe, not enough to ask the questions he was not permitting himself to ask. Alice's voice on the rare occasions they spoke carried the particular quality of someone exercising considerable restraint, and he was grateful to her for the restraint even as he understood that it cost her something. She wanted to tell him things. He could hear it in the pauses between her sentences, in the specific neutrality of her tone, which was a shade too careful to be natural. She had always been expressive and immediate with him, her thoughts reaching him before her words in most conversations, and the deliberateness with which she was withholding told him as much as any words could have about what she was choosing not to say. He told himself this was the correct arrangement. He had made a decision, and the integrity of that decision required not undermining it with information that would make it harder to sustain. He joined the family in Alaska briefly in the second month. The Denali house sat at the edge of a wilderness that went on for longer than most human maps bothered to detail. All pale winter light and silence of the geographic variety, the vast impersonal quiet of a landscape that was simply too large and too old to concern itself with the difficulties of the creatures moving through it. He had always found Alaska clarifying in this way, had returned to it in difficult periods before. The scale of it made individual suffering seem appropriately sized. Esme held him for a long time when he arrived, her arms around him with the uncomplicated warmth of someone for whom the complexity of the situation did not diminish the simplicity of her feeling. She did not ask him questions or offer assessments. She simply held on, and he received it and was grateful for it, and did not trust himself to speak without saying something that would require her to comfort him further, which he felt he did not deserve. Carlyle watched him with the physician's eye he brought to everything, the steady, diagnostic attention that was not intrusiveness, but care of it, the most practiced kind. He did not renew the argument he had made before Edward left. He understood, as he always understood, when argument had reached its limit, and what was required instead was simply witness. The commitment to remaining present for someone without requiring them to be other than what they were. Carlyle had been doing this for 3 centuries. He was very good at it. Rosalie's thoughts on the subject were layered in ways that Edward chose not to press against too deeply. He caught the surface of them, the complicated mixture of indication and something that was not quite sympathy, but occupied the space adjacent to it, and let the rest remain private in the way that family learned to allow each other privacy, even without the ordinary walls that human minds erected between themselves. Emmett said nothing, which was exactly correct. He clapped Edward on the shoulder once, with the particular deliberate gentleness of a man calibrating enormous strength toward a specific softness, and the gesture contained everything that a conversation would have diluted. Edward received it as it was intended. Jasper kept his distance throughout the visit, and Edward understood why completely and held no grievance about it. The empathic gift that made Jasper the most sensitive reader of emotional atmosphere in any room also made him the most vulnerable to the kind of sustained emotional weight that Edward was generating without any ability to moderate it. Grief of this particular quality, layered, chosen, self-inflicted, and therefore complicated by the guilt that ran through it like a current, was not something Jasper could simply partition away from his own experience. They acknowledged each other across whatever room they shared, a mutual recognition that asked nothing further, and that was sufficient. He stayed 2 weeks and then left again, feeling the house beginning to shape itself around his presence in ways that implied expectation. An expectation implied a future he was not ready to inhabit. He tried, in the months that followed, to return to the practices that had sustained him in the long decades before Bella. Music, which he had always been able to disappear into. Literature, the particular satisfaction of learning, of pressing into a subject until it yielded its interior logic and became known. He sat in a room in a house he was borrowing in the north of Canada, with a volume of philosophy he had not read in 30 years and read 3 pages in 2 hours, and understood that the words were reaching his eyes without reaching anything further, that he was performing the act of reading without engaging the capacity that reading required, the willingness to be present with something outside your own mind long enough to let it matter. He closed the book and did not try again for several weeks. He began to notice, somewhere in the 3rd month, that he was measuring time differently than he had before. Before Bella, time had been something he moved through with the patient detachment of a species for whom its passage held no urgency. A month was a month. A decade was a decade. The categories were real, but not felt. the way the categories of geography are real to someone who cannot see the borders on the ground. But he was counting now, not forward toward anything, simply counting the way a person counts, because the alternative is to stop registering that time is passing at all. And stopping felt like a concession he was not willing to make. He did not ask Alice how Bella was. He assembled this restraint carefully and repeatedly. Each time the question formed in him and pressed against the decision he had made to keep it unasked. He told himself that knowing she was healing would be a relief he had not earned, a comfort purchased with her pain that he had no right to collect. He told himself that knowing she was struggling would be a torture he could not act on, that the knowledge would only produce the impulse to return, and returning would undo the only thing his leaving had been intended to accomplish. He told himself these things with the patience of someone who knows the argument by heart because they have made it many times. He told himself these things in the particular way of a person who is not quite convincing themselves, but has decided to behave as though they are, because the alternative is to admit that the architecture of the decision was built on a foundation that is not holding the weight being placed on it. And in the long, loud nights, in every wilderness and city and unnamed stretch of territory he moved through, he listened to the thoughts of strangers and felt the absence of her silence like a frequency his mind had been tuned to receive and could not now retune, could not redirect toward anything else, could only keep reaching for in the automatic, helpless way of something designed for a specific purpose, encountering the world without it. Then this vision reached him the way Alice's visions always reached him when she was close enough. Not as a warning, not as a carefully prepared communication, but as an involuntary broadcast, her mind opening onto the image before she had fully processed it herself. He was in Rio de Janeiro, moving through the crowded northern districts in the particular way he moved through dense human populations, present but unremarked, his stillness and his beauty registering on people's awareness as something slightly outside the ordinary range, but not quite nameable. When he felt Alice's consciousness flare at the edge of his range with something that was not her usual quality of thought, he turned toward it without deciding to. The image she was seeing was brief and incomplete, the way visions of Bella always were, always obscured by the particular quality of Bella's mind that resisted Alice's gift the way it resisted Edward's own. But incomplete was not nothing. What came through was enough. Water, a great deal of it, rising. A cliff edge. A figure that was unmistakably Bella, in the specific way that Alice's visions carried identity even through visual ambiguity. Something in the posture and the particularity of the silhouette that was entirely her. And then the figure was gone, and the water was all there was. And Alice's thought in response to her own vision was a single, sharp, wordless spike of horror. Edward stopped moving. He stood in the middle of a street in a city of millions, and he stood completely, inhumanly still, and the people around him parted and flowed past him, the way water parts around a fixed object, and he did not notice any of it, because his entire consciousness had narrowed to a single point. That was the absence of what he had just seen. He called the Swan House. He did this before he had consciously decided to do it, his hands performing the action, while the part of his mind that made decisions was still somewhere several seconds behind, still attempting to process the image Alice had transmitted. still looking for an interpretation that was not the one presenting itself with terrible clarity. The phone rang 3 times, 4 times, and then someone answered. It was not Bella. The voice was male and young and carried the particular quality of someone who had been recently asleep, rough at the edges in the way of interrupted rest. Edward did not know the voice with certainty, but he understood it immediately in the way that he had been understanding Jacob Black as an increasingly significant presence in the information he gathered about Bella's life from the periphery of it. He had not asked Alice directly about Jacob, had forbidden himself that specific inquiry along with all the others, but information had reached him anyway through the oblique channels of family conversation, and the things Alice did not quite successfully conceal in her thoughts. He asked for Bella. There was a pause, and then the voice said something that Edward would spend the rest of his existence returning to with the specific compulsion of a mind that cannot leave a wound alone. The flat, uninflected delivery of someone reporting a fact without understanding the full weight of what they were reporting, or perhaps understanding it precisely and choosing the flattest possible delivery for reasons of their own. He said that Bella was at the funeral. Edward heard those words and felt the structure of his reasoning collapse all at once. The entire careful architecture of the months he had spent convincing himself that his departure had been an act of love rather than an act of fear, that she was living her human life as he had intended, that the world in which Bella Swan existed was continuing without him in the way that worlds do. The funeral, the flat, simple, terrible word, and what it meant, combined with Alice's vision, combined with the silence on the other end of the line where Jacob Black was not offering comfort or context or anything except the fact itself. He set the phone down. He did not move for a long time. This was not paralysis. It was the stillness of a mind that has received information it cannot immediately integrate, that is running through every possible interpretation of the available evidence and finding that the interpretations converge on a single point from which there is no navigating away. Alice's vision, the cliff, the water, the funeral. He'd spent months refusing to ask how she was, and the answer to the question he had not asked was this. The grief was not what he would have predicted. He had known grief before. His mother, the life he should have lived, the decades of loneliness that had settled into him like sediment until he had ceased to register them as loss and accepted them simply as the texture of his existence. He knew what grief felt like, but this was something different in kind, not just in degree. This was the grief of having been the cause, of having made the decision that had led here through a chain of consequences he had told himself he could predict and had predicted entirely wrong. He had left her to give her a life, and she had not had a life, and now she was not having any life at all. He became very calm. This was the thing that would have frightened anyone who knew him, who understood that in Edward's case, the calmness that followed extreme emotional impact was not composure, but its opposite. Not the settling of turbulence, but the cessation of everything that turbulence had previously been organized around. He was calm the way a room is calm after everything in it has been removed. A functional calm, deliberate and purposeful. The calm of someone who has identified the one remaining thing that makes sense and is moving toward it with complete intention. He would go to Volterra. The decision was simple in the way that decisions become simple when the framework of reasons not to has been entirely removed. He was not suicidal in the way the word applied to humans, with its clinical freight of despair and impaired judgment, and the temporary nature of pain that feels permanent. He was something more deliberate than that. He was a vampire who had lived nearly a century and who understood with complete clarity that existing without the person who had made existence bearable was simply not a project he was willing to continue. And he knew how a vampire ended his existence, what was required, and where the entities capable of performing that service resided. The Volturi would not grant death as a mercy. He understood this perfectly. Aro did not dispense endings as acts of kindness to the lovesick or the bereaved. If Edward walked into Volterra and asked to die, Aro would find the request amusing and decline it, and offer him a position in the guard instead, which was the Volturi's answer to almost everything. Edward would need to give them a reason that was not a request. He would need to do something sufficiently public, sufficiently visible, sufficiently violating of the fundamental law of vampire secrecy, that the Volturi would have no choice but to respond with the force he required. He began moving toward Italy. Alice found him before he reached the airport. He heard her before he saw her, her mind already reaching toward his with the particular frequency of someone who has been running at full speed and is not interested in pretense or preamble. She appeared at the edge of the terminal with her small frame and her too fast movement and her expression, which carried the specific combination of fury and terror and love that only family could generate simultaneously. She told him Bella was alive. He heard the words. He processed them with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to all information. And then he stood with them for a moment and understood that he did not believe her. Not because he thought she was lying. Alice did not lie to him, but because the architecture of certainty he had constructed in the last several hours had been built to bear weight, and dismantling it required more than words, even Alice's words. He told her he needed confirmation. Alice's frustration was immediate and audible even without reading her mind, the sharp exhale of someone who has run across the city to prevent a catastrophe and is being asked for documentation. She told him she had seen it, that Bella was alive, that the cliff had been a foolish human choice rather than what he had concluded, that Jacob Black's words had been stripped of the context that would have made them intelligible. He told her again, quietly, that he needed to hear Bella's voice. He could not explain to Alice, not in the time available, the specific quality of his uncertainty. It was not distrust of Alice's gift. It was something more fundamental, the understanding that he had been wrong before, had been wrong about the most important thing, had left Bella on the basis of a certainty that had turned out to be hubris dressed as logic, and that if he was going to abandon this plan, this clean and certain plan, on the basis of new information, the new information needed to be the kind that he could not find a way to doubt. Bella's voice would be that kind. Alice called Bella's house from her own phone. The call connected. She handed it to Edward without speaking, her eyes on his face with the intensity of someone watching for a specific outcome. He heard breathing. Then her voice, confused and drowsy, and entirely, undeniably alive. She said hello. Just that word, unadorned, inflected with a slight uncertainty of someone who did not recognize the number calling, but it was her voice. It was the voice he had spent months trying to stop hearing in the spaces between other sounds. The voice that had become, over the course of their time together, the most familiar and most necessary sound in his experience. It was her. He could not speak. He stood with the phone against his ear and listened to her say hello a second time, and then a third. The confusion in her voice increasing as the silence on his end continued, and he could not produce a single word because the relief was too large for the available aperture, and everything had temporarily stopped functioning except the part of him that was simply receiving the fact of her aliveness with every available sense. Alice took the phone back. He let her. They were at the airport. He was still going to Volterra. Alice turned on him at this, her thought sharp with a particular anger of someone who has just received confirmation that the crisis has been averted and cannot understand why the person in the crisis is not standing down. He told her that it did not matter, that alive now was not alive always, that as long as the Volturi knew a human possessed the knowledge Bella possessed, her life was conditional on a promise Alice had made in her throne room months ago, a promise that Bella would be transformed, that the secret would be contained, and that promise had not been kept and would not be treated as binding indefinitely. He told her he was going to present himself to the Volturi and offer them the resolution they required, his own ending, in exchange for Bella's permanent safety. The Volturi did not want him dead, he knew. Aro wanted his gift, but he would make himself sufficiently costly to keep alive, and the transaction would resolve cleanly. Alice stood in the middle of the terminal and looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face in all the decades of their siblinghood, and she said that she was going with him, and that was the end of the discussion. He did not argue. He understood that he had lost the argument before it began, that Alice had already seen how this unfolded, and that her presence in Volterra was not a negotiation, but a fact she had already witnessed. They boarded together. The plane moved south and east toward Italy and the oldest vampires in existence, and Edward sat with his hands still and his face still, and the sound of Bella's voice, 3 words long, playing in the interior of his mind on a loop that he did not try to stop, that he allowed, because it was the last thing he would permit himself before Volterra required him to be something colder and more deliberate than a person who had simply, irrevocably loved someone too much and too badly, and at far too great a cost to everyone involved. Volterra was beautiful in the way that very old things are sometimes beautiful, not despite their age, but because of it, because centuries of accumulated human presence had worn everything to a particular smoothness, the stones of the streets and the walls of the buildings carrying the specific patina of time that could not be manufactured or imitated. Edward moved through the city's outer streets with Alice beside him and felt the age of the place pressing against his awareness with a weight that even his own century of existence did not fully prepare him for. The Volturi had been here since before the city had its current name. The stones remembered them even if the humans walking over those stones did not. The square was full. It was a festival day, which Edward had known and had chosen deliberately. The festival of San Marco, the streets crowded with tourists and locals in red robes, the kind of public spectacle that would provide exactly the visibility he required. He had planned this with the clean efficiency brought to things when emotion had been set aside in favor of function. and he moved through the crowd toward the far edge of the square where the shadows ended and the full afternoon sunlight began, with the steady purpose of someone who has already completed the deliberation and is now simply executing. Alice grabbed his arm. Her grip was small and absolute, the grip of someone whose strength bore no relationship to her size, and she spoke to him in a rapid, low voice that only his hearing could have separated from the noise of the crowd. She told him Bella was coming, that she had seen it just now, the vision resolving as Bella made the decision that produced it. Bella running, Bella reaching the square, Bella arriving before Edward reached the light. He heard this. He measured the distance between himself and the edge of the shadow. He measured the probability, the margins, the gap between Alice's vision and the present moment in which anything could still change. He took one more step toward the light. She hit him like a collision, which was the only word for it. A warm, breathing, entirely human collision that struck him from the side and drove him back into the shadow with a force that should not have been possible from someone her size against someone his. But she had the advantage of surprise and trajectory, and he had the disadvantage of a half second of complete disorientation at the impossible fact of her presence. And the result was that he was against the wall and she was against him, and her arms were around him with the desperation of someone who has run a very long way, very fast, and has stopped here and will not be moved. He could not process it. He had a system for receiving information, a century of practice at integrating what his senses reported, and moving from data to understanding with the speed his nature allowed. But the system failed entirely in the face of her, the warmth of her, the specific and unmistakable sound of her heartbeat, racing from the run but present, entirely present, loud against his silent chest in a way that seemed to him in that moment like the loudest thing he had ever heard. The scent of her, which he had spent months trying to cease to hold in memory, and which his memory had apparently preserved with perfect fidelity because every detail of it was immediately and completely recognizable. He thought he was hallucinating. This was his first coherent thought. That grief and intention and the months of deliberate self-denial had finally produced in him the kind of break from accurate perception that he had observed in humans under extreme duress, that he was standing in a shadow in Volterra, holding a hallucination, and that the hallucination was warm. He brought one hand up to her face. His fingers touched her cheek, and the warmth that met them was not the warmth of imagined sensation, but the specific, differentiated warmth of living human skin, carrying its own temperature, its own texture, its own undeniable reality. She was real. The understanding moved through him slowly, which was unusual for a mind that processed most things at a speed humans could not follow. It moved slowly because it was very large, and the space it needed to occupy had been closed off for a long time, and reopening it required a kind of structural shift that could not be rushed. She was real. She was alive. She was here in Volterra, having come here somehow, having found him in a square full of strangers in the city in Italy, and she was real. He said her name. He heard his own voice say it and barely recognized it. They did not have time. The Volturi guard found them before the moment could extend further. Dimitri and Felix emerging from the crowd with the particular smooth efficiency of beings who had been performing this specific function for centuries and had reduced it to something almost graceful. Edward read their minds as they approached, cataloguing capabilities and intentions. With the automatic tactical assessment he could not turn off even now, even with Bella warm and alive in his arms. Dimitri's mind was precise and professional, the mind of someone who tracked and retrieved and did not involve himself in the outcomes beyond delivering what he was sent to deliver. Felix was simpler and more physical, already calculating weight and force and the positions of bodies in a space, the habitual assessment of a creature who settled most problems through direct violence. Neither of them was uncertain about the outcome of a physical confrontation, and neither of them was wrong to be confident. Edward chose not to fight in the square. This was a deliberate choice, made in the span of a breath, and it was made entirely because of Bella. Because fighting in the square meant exposure. Exposure meant complications, and complications in Volterra, with Bella present, meant outcomes he could not control. He went with them. He kept himself between Bella and Felix with a physical persistence that Felix noticed and found faintly amusing, which Edward read in his thoughts and ignored. They took them underground. The passages beneath Volterra had the quality of all very old underground spaces, the particular cool and dark of places that had been sealed away from the ordinary progression of the world above, where time moved differently because there was nothing to measure it against. Edward had been in spaces like this before, had passed through the underground territories of old vampire strongholds on the periphery of the Volturi's reach. But he had never been here, to the center of it, and he felt the weight of what this place had been for 3,000 years pressing against his awareness with a seriousness that demanded acknowledgement. Aro received them in the main chamber. He was smaller than some imagined tyrants to be, slight and pale in the way of something that had been refining itself over millennia. His dark robes carrying the kind of quality that wealth accumulates when it has had long enough to develop genuine taste rather than the performance of it. His eyes were red, as the eyes of all vampires who fed on human blood eventually became, but with an age and depth to them that gave them a different quality than the red eyes of recently fed nomads. These were eyes that had been accumulating what they saw for 3,000 years, and what they saw now, as they settled on Edward and Bella and Alice, was interest. Caius stood to one side, his presence sharper and less patient than Aro's, his thoughts carrying the particular edge of someone whose primary relationship to the world was through the enforcement of rules rather than the enjoyment of them. He did not find the situation interesting. He found it a problem that should be resolved quickly, and without the prolonged deliberation he already anticipated Aro would subject it to. Marco stood apart, as he always stood apart. Edward had read enough about Marcus to approach his thoughts with a particular caution, and what he found there confirmed what he had heard. A consciousness that had been present for 3 millennia and had withdrawn from active engagement with its own presence to a degree that was not quite anywhere Edward had a name for. Not despair, not peace, not acceptance. Something beyond all of those, a state that the ordinary vocabulary of emotional experience could not quite reach. Marcus observed the situation with the detached completeness of someone for whom outcomes had long since ceased to differentiate themselves from one another in any way that mattered. Aro moved toward them with the delighted curiosity of a collector who has just encountered something unexpected in a familiar gallery. He took Edward's hand. The experience of being read by Aro's gift was unlike anything Edward had encountered in his century of reading others. His own ability was passive and involuntary, a receiving that happened whether he invited it or not, a constant ambient awareness of the thoughts around him that he had learned to filter but never to stop. Aro's gift was different, active, complete, archival. Aro did not read the surface of Edward's current thoughts. He read everything, every memory Edward had formed since his transformation, every feeling he had processed or suppressed, every moment of the last months laid open and examined with the thoroughness of someone who had been doing this for 3,000 years and found the interior of other minds genuinely, inexhaustibly interesting. It was the most profound violation Edward had experienced. He stood with it and did not react outwardly, because reacting outwardly would have been interpreted as weakness, and weakness in this room had specific consequences. Aro released his hand with an expression of genuine pleasure that was somehow more unsettling than displeasure would have been. He spoke at length about Edward's gift, about the rarity of a mind reader whose ability functioned at range rather than requiring contact, about what an extraordinary addition such an ability would make to the talents already assembled in Volterra. The offer was extended with the warmth of someone who believed they were conferring an honor rather than making a threat, and Edward read in Aro's thoughts that the warmth was not entirely performed. Aro genuinely admired what he wanted, which did not make him any less dangerous for wanting it. Then Aro turned his attention to Bella. The deliberation in the throne room concerning Bella's fate was conducted with the elaborate procedural courtesy that the Volturi applied to everything, which was its own kind of menace. The use of civilized forms to discuss uncivilized outcomes. The position was simple. Bella knew. She had known for some time, and the promise Alice had made on her behalf had not been fulfilled, and the Volturi's law on this point was not a matter of discretion or flexibility. A human who knew about vampires was either transformed or removed. Those were the options the law allowed. Aro presented this not with cruelty, but with the tone of someone explaining a constraint they themselves were subject to, a rule of the universe rather than a rule of their making. Jane was there. She had been there from the beginning, positioned at a distance that was casual in appearance and deliberate in fact. And when Aro's glance moved to her, the demonstration was brief and complete and entirely unnecessary from a practical standpoint. Edward experienced Jane's gift with the full awareness that it was a gift and not a physical reality, and found that this knowledge did nothing to modify the experience, that his mind produced the pain his body was not actually sustaining with the same fidelity it produced everything else. And he did not make a sound because the only person in this room whose reaction he was managing was Bella, and Bella did not need to see him break. Alice stepped forward before the deliberation could resolve in the direction it was moving toward. She offered Aro her hand, and Aro took it, and Edward watched his face as he moved through Alice's visions. The futures she had seen that included Bella as a vampire. The specific clarity of those images contrasted against the fuzzy indistinction of the futures in which she remained human. Aro considered this for a long moment. Then he smiled. He said that Alice's gift was, if anything, more impressive than her brother's, and that on the basis of what he had just witnessed, he was prepared to extend the existing arrangement for a period sufficient to allow the promise to be fulfilled, provided the fulfillment occurred within a reasonable time frame, and that Alice was prepared to stand as guarantor of the outcome. Alice said that she was. Edward heard the binding quality of what had just been agreed to, the specific weight of a promise made to the Volturi, which was not the weight of a promise made among people who might be disappointed if it was broken, but the weight of a promise made to entities who had 3,000 years of demonstrated capacity for follow-through. He heard it and said nothing, because saying something would have been less useful than simply understanding it completely, which he did. They were permitted to leave. The flight back from Italy passed in a silence that was not peaceful but held, the way a breath is held, a suspension of the things that needed to be said until the conditions existed for saying them. Edward sat beside Bella through the hours of the return journey and did not attempt conversation, understanding that conversation required a kind of presence from both parties that neither of them fully had available. Bella slept for most of it, her body making the claim that her mind had been too occupied to allow during the hours in Volterra. And Edward watched her sleep with the particular quality of attention he had given it in all the months before his leaving. The same watchfulness, but carrying now an entirely different weight, the weight of something nearly lost and recovered, which was a heavier thing to hold than something simply possessed. He listened to her heartbeat for the duration of the flight. He did this without apology to himself, without the internal negotiation about whether he was permitted to need it. He needed it. The sound of it, steady and present at the rate of a sleeping human's resting pulse, was the most important information available to him in those hours, and he received it with the full attention it deserved. He had nearly caused it to stop. This was the thought he kept returning to, turning over with the specific compulsion of a mind that cannot leave a wound alone. Not the dramatic near ending in Volterra, though that was part of it, but the months before, the leaving, the deliberate withdrawal that had produced in Bella the particular kind of damage that had led, through a chain of causes he had not adequately traced before making his decision, to a girl standing on a cliff above cold water, making choices she should not have been in a position to make. He had nearly caused it to stop, and he had done so in the name of protecting her. He did not resolve this thought on the plane. He held it without resolution, because resolution required more than one person, and the other person was asleep. Charlie was waiting when they arrived. Edward read Charlie's thoughts from the driveway before they had reached the front door, and what he found there was the specific combination of relief and fury that a parent produces when a child has been frightened into revealing exactly how much they were loved by the act of almost being lost. Charlie had known something was wrong for months, had watched Bella move through the aftermath of Edward's leaving with the careful observation of a man who did not always have the words for what he saw, but saw it nonetheless. And the disappearance to Italy had been the point at which his quiet concern had sharpened into something more acute. He looked at Edward with an expression that communicated clearly and without ambiguity that Edward's presence in his house was a conditional arrangement, and that the conditions had recently been tested and had not entirely held. Edward accepted this. He understood it as the correct response to the available information, and he made no attempt to manage or redirect Charlie's assessment of him, because Charlie was not wrong. Bella negotiated the homecoming with the exhausted efficiency of someone who had been managing other people's fear of her own well-being for long enough to have developed a technique for it. Edward stayed close and said little, and let Bella's voice do the work of reassurance, which it did with more skill than the situation strictly warranted. And eventually, Charlie's thoughts moved from active suspicion to a grudging, watchful acceptance that was the closest thing to welcome Edward was likely to receive that evening. The conversation he had been waiting for came the following afternoon. Carlyle had called the family together in the main room of the house outside Forks, and they assembled with the particular quality of a group of people who had all been thinking about the same thing and were now in the same room for the purpose of thinking about it collectively. Edward stood near the window. Bella sat in the center of the room in the way she always sat in rooms full of vampires, not comfortable, not relaxed, but present with a deliberate and conscious choice that he had spent months and now understood more fully than he had before. She asked them to vote. She said it plainly, without preamble, with a directness that she brought to things when she had decided that indirectness was a form of dishonesty she was not willing to practice. She said she wanted to be transformed. She said she understood what she was asking, that she had understood it for some time and had not asked impulsively or without consideration. She said she was asking them now because Volterra had clarified the timeline in ways that removed the luxury of indefinite delay. Edward heard every mind in the room shift at her words, each in their own direction. Alice voted first, yes, and the yes was not reluctant. It carried the specific warmth of someone who had seen versions of this future and had already built some part of her feeling toward it, who loved Bella in the present and was prepared to love what Bella would become. Her thoughts were clear and consistent, the vote and the feeling behind it matching without complication. Jasper voted yes with the pragmatism of a military mind that had assessed the situation and determined that the current arrangement was not sustainable and that the available alternatives resolved in this direction. His yes was not warm in the way Alice's was, but it was honest and complete, and Edward respected the honesty of it even while hearing the calculation beneath. Emmett's yes came with the characteristic absence of the prolonged deliberation the question probably deserved, his thoughts carrying the simple logic of someone for whom Bella had already been family for long enough that making that fact permanent seemed straightforwardly correct. He looked at Edward when he said it, which was his own kind of commentary. Rosalie said no. She said it quietly and without the sharpness that might have characterized her position on this subject in earlier months, and what Edward heard in her mind beneath the word was something more complex than the resentment he might once have expected to find there. Rosalie had looked at Bella in the throne room in Volterra, or had seen what Alice had seen of it, and had registered something. She still believed that human life was a thing of irreplaceable value, still believed that Bella was trading something precious for something that only resembled a gift from a distance. But the bitterness had been modified, somewhere in the months of Edward's absence and the events that had followed, by a reluctant acknowledgement that Bella's choice was genuinely Bella's choice in a way that Rosalie's own transformation had never been hers. She said no, and she meant it, and she also held it without forcing it on anyone else, which was a different thing than she would have done a year ago. Esme said yes with the particular emotion of someone for whom the outcome of the vote had never been in question, and for whom the formality of saying the word was simply the smallest gesture she could make toward a feeling that was much larger. She looked at Bella when she said it, and Bella received it with the slight overwhelmed quality she always had when Esme's warmth reached her. The look of someone who had not quite stopped being surprised that she was loved in this particular room. Carlyle voted last. He said yes, and his yes carried the full weight of what it meant. A physician's vote, a maker's awareness of what he was endorsing. The understanding that yes in this room was not a theoretical position, but an eventual action that he or someone in this family would be required to perform. He said yes anyway, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought about this for much longer than the conversation had been in progress. Edward said no. He said it into the room where everyone else had just said yes, in the particular position of being the only dissenting voice on a question about the person he loved most. And he said it with the full awareness of how it would be received, and the inability to say anything different. He'd thought about this in the way he thought about everything that mattered, completely, from every angle, with a kind of thoroughness that could not be accused of haste. He had thought about it on the plane from Italy, and in the hours since, and in all the months before that, when transformation had been an abstract future item rather than a present question with a present vote attached to it. He had thought about Bella's soul, which he believed in for her, even when he could not believe in his own, and what he understood transformation to cost in that specific currency. He had thought about the thirst, the decades of constant struggle that awaited her if she became what he was, the particular quality of an existence defined by managing a nature you had not chosen. He had thought about what she would lose, the warmth, the color, the passage of time in the human way, the ability to be in a room full of people without monitoring her own responses with the vigilance of a soldier. He had thought about all of it and arrived at no. Bella turned to look at him, and what he saw in her face was not entirely surprise. She had expected this, or some version of this, had prepared for the possibility that his vote would be different from the others. But expecting a thing and receiving it were not the same, and what moved across her expression in the moment after he spoke was something he would have given a great deal to be able to read from the inside. She asked him why. He told her about the soul. He said it plainly as he could manage, knowing that the argument sounded different from outside than from inside. That to someone who did not share his specific theological dread, it could sound like an abstraction being used to override a concrete decision. He said he believed she had a soul, and he was not certain he had one, and he was not willing to be the instrument of her losing something. He could not confirm she would not miss. Bella's response was immediate and clear-eyed in the way her responses always were, when she had thought about something longer than the person presenting it to her. She told him that she had considered the soul question and had arrived at a different conclusion, that she did not accept his assessment of the transaction, that the terms he was using to describe what transformation cost her were not the terms she was using to describe it from where she stood. She told him that his no was not a protection, but a veto, and that there was a difference. Edward heard this. He sat with it in the way he had learned, imperfectly and recently, to sit with things she said that required sitting with, rather than immediate response. She was applying the same logic Carlyle had applied in the days before his leaving, the same argument that he had heard and considered and moved past. That making decisions about Bella's life while nominally making them for Bella's benefit was an exercise of a kind of power that required more justification than good intentions. He told her that he would make her a different offer. He heard the shift in the room's quality of attention when he said it. The slight adjustment of focus that happened when something unexpected was introduced into a conversation that had appeared to be reaching its conclusion. He had not planned to say what he was about to say in quite this way, in this room, with everyone present. But the vote had produced a result that left him with limited alternatives, and the thing he was about to offer was the most honest thing available to him, which was the minimum standard he was trying to hold himself to. He told her he would transform her himself, that he would be the one when the time came, if it came to that. But he asked her for something first. He asked her to marry him. The silence that followed was of the specific variety that silence becomes when a room full of people simultaneously decides not to think loudly. Edward heard the effort that his family was making to give him and Bella the interior privacy that the situation warranted, heard the deliberate blankness they were each generating in their own way, and was grateful for it. Bella stared at him. He heard her heartbeat change, not dramatically, not in the way it changed when she was frightened, but in the subtler way it changed when she was processing something that had arrived from an unexpected direction and needed to be examined before she could respond to it honestly. He could not hear her thoughts. He never could. But he could hear that acceleration, and he could see the particular expression on her face that she produced when she was not going to give him a quick answer. And he waited. She asked him if he was doing this to stall. He told her that he was doing this because he wanted it, which was true, and that it would also create the conditions for a delay he believed she owed him the courtesy of, which was also true, and that both things could be simultaneously true without either one cancelling the other out. She told him she would think about it. He told her that was all he was asking. It was not all he was asking, and they both understood that, and neither of them said so, because some things were better left in the space between what was said and what was meant, where they could be examined privately before being brought into the open. Edward had spent enough time in other people's minds to know that the space between words was not empty, but full, and that what lived there was often more honest than what lived in the words themselves. He looked at her across the quiet room, this girl who had voted for her own transformation with more composure than most people brought to significantly smaller decisions, and he understood with the complete and undefended clarity that sometimes arrived at the end of long deliberation that whatever happened next, whatever she decided, whatever the family decided, whatever the Voltree's timeline ultimately demanded, he was not going to leave again. This was not a decision he announced. He did not say it aloud or formalize it with the kind of declaration that might have been expected after the weeks of drama that had preceded it. He simply knew it, with the quality of knowledge that settles into the structure of a person, rather than sitting on the surface of their thoughts, the kind that does not require regular reinforcement, because it has become load-bearing. He was staying, whatever that cost, whatever it required, whatever came next, he was staying. He had told himself he would not go back. This was the first rule he had established in the days immediately following his departure from Forks, assembled with the same careful logic he had applied to the decision to leave itself. Going back served nothing. Going back was the action of someone who had made a choice and then immediately began undermining it, which was not a choice at all, but a performance of one, the kind of self-deception that insulted both the person practicing it and the person it was supposedly protecting. He had left for reasons. The reasons did not expire because the leaving was difficult. He broke the rule for the first time 3 weeks after walking away from her in the forest. He told himself it was a check, a single, bounded verification that she was physically safe, that Charlie was present and attentive, that the ordinary machinery of her human life was continuing to function in his absence. He told himself it was the responsible action of someone who had removed a layer of protection from a person who had previously required it, and that confirming she was all right was not the same as going back in any meaningful sense. It was surveillance, not return. There was a difference. He ran the familiar route from the Cullen house to the edge of Charlie's property in the dark hours of an early morning, moving through the forest that separated their two worlds with the speed that made the distance irrelevant. He stopped at the tree line. He stood there in the dark between the forest and the edge of the yard, close enough to hear the heartbeats inside the house and nothing more. And he listened. 2 heartbeats, both present, both maintaining the steady rhythm of untroubled sleep. He stood there for longer than a check required. Then he ran back. The second visit came a week later, and the third a week after that, and somewhere in the establishment of this rhythm, he stopped pretending to himself that it was a check and acknowledged it for what it was, the only form of proximity he had permitted himself, the closest available approximation of the thing he had removed from his life, the way an amputated limb is said to be felt for years after its removal in the exact space it no longer occupies. What he observed from the tree line in those early weeks was worse than what he had prepared himself to witness, and he had not prepared himself adequately to begin with. She was present, but not present. He could see her through the windows on the evenings when the lights were on and the curtains were not drawn, moving through the kitchen, sitting at the table, performing the ordinary functions of a human life, with the mechanical quality of someone operating on instructions rather than volition. Charlie watched her with the helpless concern of a man who did not know how to address what he was seeing, and was trying anyway. His thoughts on the evenings when Edward ranged close enough to catch them full of the particular anguish of a parent confronted with a child's pain they cannot reach. Edward watched her move through the house and did not go in. He held the tree line with both hands, metaphorically, and stayed where he was, and told himself that what he was witnessing was temporary, that the human capacity for recovery was genuine and documented, and would assert itself given sufficient time. He watched for the recovery the way someone watches a wound for signs of healing, with the daily attentiveness of someone who needs to see improvement and is not yet seeing it. By the second month, he had mapped the shape of her days with the thoroughness that his observation and his access to the thoughts of those around her provided. Jessica Stanley's mind on the days when she and Bella were in proximity at school was a reliable source of information. Jessica thought about Bella with the mixture of genuine concern and mild frustration of someone who found sustained sadness in another person, uncomfortable, who wanted her friend to be better partly for Bella's sake, and partly because Bella's not betterness required ongoing accommodation. Through Jessica's thoughts, Edward learned that Bella was present at school, was completing her work, was not alarming her teachers in ways that had triggered formal concern. She was functioning. This was the word he kept using, carefully, deliberately, as if the precision of the word would contain the weight of what it described. She was functioning. He began to understand, somewhere in the 3rd month, that someone else was pulling her back towards something more than functioning. He did not have a name for it at first. He had only the observation that Bella's movements had changed, that there was a direction to them now, a pull toward the La Push area that she had not previously demonstrated, a pattern of departure and return that suggested purpose rather than the aimless motion he had been watching. He traced it through the available channels, through the thoughts of the people at the edges of her life who saw her and thought about where she had been and where she was going. Jacob Black. He had known about Jacob in the abstract way he had known about most things in Bella's life during the months of his absence, as a name, a connection, a person who existed in her world and occasionally featured in the thoughts of those around her. He had not assigned him particular significance. He had not needed to assign him significance because he had not been watching closely enough in the early weeks to see the significance accumulating. He saw it now. He traced it backward through what he had observed and found it in the pattern of her movements, in the way the direction of La Push appeared in her schedule with increasing frequency as the weeks progressed. He read it in Charlie's thoughts on evenings when Bella returned from that direction. The relief that was becoming less relief and more expectation. The way Charlie had begun to factor Jacob's presence into his assessment of Bella's well-being as a reliable variable rather than an occasional bonus. Something in this observation settled in him with a complicated weight that he did not examine too closely, because he understood that examining it closely would require him to sit with a jealousy that had no moral standing. That was the jealousy of someone who had chosen to leave being unsettled by the discovery that life had continued in his absence. He had wanted life to continue for her. He had made her pain in order to produce that continuation. The fact of Jacob Black was the evidence that his intention had partially succeeded, and he was not permitted to resent the evidence of his own success. He told himself this with some regularity. He watched from a greater distance through the 4th month, pulling back the perimeter of his observation as Bella's life showed increasing signs of the forward motion he had intended for her. The withdrawal cost him something he did not try to calculate precisely, but it felt like the correct proportional response. She was healing, and his proximity to her healing was itself a form of intrusion he was not entitled to maintain indefinitely. He encountered Laurent by accident, or what he understood afterward to have been accident, in the wilderness corridor between Forks and the Canadian border. Laurent was moving south, which Edward registered without immediate alarm. Nomads moved through the Pacific Northwest regularly, the vampire equivalent of a thoroughfare, and Laurent had seemed at their last meeting to be the most genuinely diplomatic of the three nomads who had interrupted the baseball game, the most oriented toward avoiding conflict. He read Laurent's intentions at range. What he found was complex and not entirely reassuring. Laurent was curious, was maintaining the half-formed plan of a creature without strong commitments moving toward an available option, was thinking about Bella with a specific quality of thought that Edward recognized as appetite adjacent to strategy. He was not yet decided. He was the kind of dangerous that had not fully committed to being dangerous. Edward followed Laurent's progress toward Forks for 2 days, staying far enough back that Laurent did not detect his presence, reading his thoughts as they evolved and shifted toward the direction of the Swan house with increasing specificity. On the 3rd day, the thoughts resolved into intention, and Edward moved forward through the distance between them with the speed his nature allowed, and considered the full range of available interventions. He did not make contact with Laurent directly. He had assessed that direct confrontation carried more risk of accelerating Laurent's intentions than redirecting them, that a pursued creature either fled or committed, and commitment was the outcome he could not afford. Instead, he made his presence known through the more oblique channels available to him. The deliberate disturbance of the forest, the strategic placement of his own scent along the routes between Laurent and his destination, the territorial markers that communicated to vampire perception that this area was occupied by someone who had not approved Laurent's passage. Laurent turned north within 24 hours and did not return in the days that followed. Edward never knew, in the weeks after this encounter, exactly what happened between Laurent and Bella before Laurent left the area entirely. He gathered fragments from the peripheral thoughts of the La Push community, enough to understand that something had occurred in the meadow, that Jacob and his companions had been involved, that Bella had been present for something that had frightened her. He gathered that she was unharmed, which was the primary information, and he held the rest at a distance because pressing into it would require resources he was not certain he had available. He returned to Alaska after this. He needed the distance, and he needed the family, and he needed the specific grounding that came from being among people who knew what he was and were present for him anyway. He stayed for several weeks and allowed himself to be present in the house, to sit in the same rooms as Carlyle and Esme, to accept Esme's occasional wordless touch on his arm that communicated steadiness without requiring him to respond to it with anything except his presence. He did not tell them about the visits to Forks. He was not certain they would not already know, given Alice's visions, but the subject was not raised, and he did not raise it. Some things were between himself and the tree line, and the dark hours of the morning, and the people who loved him understood, without requiring him to explain it, that some things needed to remain that way for the time being. He was in Alaska when Alice's vision reached him. He was moving through the Denali wilderness in the grey afternoon light, not hunting, simply moving in the purposeless way he had been moving for months, when he felt Alice's mind flare at the edges of his range with something that was not her usual quality of thought. He turned toward it without deciding, too, and the world he had spent months carefully constructing around the fact of Bella Swan's continued existence rearranged itself entirely around a new and terrible fact. and all the rules he had built to manage his distance from her became, in the space of a single received image, completely beside the point. The argument had been constructed carefully. This was the thing Edward returned to most often in the weeks following Volterra, in the quiet hours when Bella was asleep and he was sitting in the familiar position of the chair in the corner of her room, listening to her breathe with a renewed attentiveness of someone who had briefly and catastrophically lost access to that sound. The argument had been carefully constructed, and careful construction was supposed to mean something. He had spent a century learning to reason precisely, to examine premises before accepting conclusions, to distrust the kind of thinking that dressed convenience as logic. He had applied all of that to the decision to leave. He had been thorough and honest and deliberate, and he had still been wrong in ways that the aftermath was only now fully revealing to him. He began to dismantle the argument the way he had built it, piece by piece, in order, without allowing himself the comfort of selective examination. The first premise had been that Bella was in danger because of him. This was true. He did not revise it. The birthday party had demonstrated with physical specificity what the abstract danger of his family's proximity meant in practice. Jasper's loss of control had been real and immediate. The harm that had nearly resulted had been real and nearly immediate, and the structural conditions that had produced it were not anomalous but inherent. Bella in a room with vampires was Bella in a room with creatures whose nature was in constant managed tension with her continued existence. The danger was not imagined. The second premise had been that removing himself would remove the danger. This was where the careful construction had first shown its flaw, though he had not seen it clearly until the months of his absence had made it visible. He had assumed that the danger to Bella was primarily proximate, that it required his presence, his family's presence, the specific intersection of her human vulnerability and their vampire nature in the same physical space. He had not adequately accounted for the ways that knowing about vampires, independent of proximity to any particular vampire, constituted its own category of ongoing risk. The Volturi had been the most obvious manifestation of this. They did not care whether Edward was in Forks or South America or the Venezuelan interior when they considered Bella's status. What they cared about was the fact of her knowledge, which persisted regardless of where he was. He had removed himself and left the danger behind. The danger had simply changed shape. The third premise was the one he found most difficult to examine honestly, because it was the one that required the most honesty about himself. The premise that Bella would recover, would heal, would redirect the life he was vacating back toward the human trajectory he was supposedly protecting. He had believed this with a certainty that he understood now in the cold light of retrospect had not been derived from evidence but from necessity. He had needed it to be true in order for the decision to be bearable, and he had treated the need as if it were a source of information, had allowed it to function as a substitute for the actual assessment he should have made. He had known Bella for nearly a year when he left her. He had spent more hours in close observation of her than he had spent observing almost any other person in his existence. He had listened to the thoughts of everyone around her, had tracked her moods and patterns and responses through dozens of situations across the full range of what their time together had encompassed. He had known, if he had been willing to look at what he knew, that Bella Swan did not redirect. She was not a person who processed loss by moving forward into new arrangements. She was a person who went deep rather than wide, who committed fully to what she committed to, who loved with the same stubborn completeness she brought to every other thing she decided mattered. He had known this and had chosen not to factor it into his prediction about how she would respond to his leaving, because factoring it in would have produced a prediction he could not live inside. He sat with this for a long time, not in the metaphorical sense of sitting with a difficult thought while continuing to move through the world, but literally, physically still, in the chair in the corner of her room, in the dark hours of a night several days after their return from Italy, while Bella slept and her heartbeat provided its steady evidence of aliveness. He sat with it the way one sits with a diagnosis, with the understanding that the facts were not going to become more comfortable through repeated examination, but that the examination was necessary anyway, that the alternative to sitting with the true account of what had happened was to carry the false one forward and allow it to shape the decisions still ahead. He had been wrong, not in the minor, correctable way of someone who had made a reasonable judgment with incomplete information. Wrong in the larger, more culpable way of someone who had had sufficient information and had declined to use it fully because using it fully would have been inconvenient. Carlyle raised it obliquely, as Carlyle did everything he raised with Edward, sideways without direct accusation, in the manner of someone who understood that the person he was speaking to was already doing the work of confronting the thing in question and needed witness more than instruction. They were in Carlyle's study in the days following the return from Italy, the familiar space with its centuries of accumulated books and the quality of light that fell through its windows in the particular Fawkes way, grey and diffuse and oddly peaceful. Carlyle was reading, or performing the posture of reading, in the way that vampires sometimes did when they wanted to create the conditions for conversation without demanding it. Edward was at the window, watching the forest, doing the same. Carlyle said, without looking up from his book, that he had been thinking about the concept of protection, about what it meant and what it required and what it cost, and specifically about the difference between protecting someone from an external threat and protecting someone from your own assessment of what was good for them. He said this as an observation, not an accusation, in the tone he used for things he had thought about carefully and wanted to share without requiring agreement. Edward said that he understood the distinction. Carlyle said that he thought Edward did understand it now, and that understanding it now was not nothing, that the timing of understanding was often outside a person's control regardless of their intelligence or their intentions, and that what mattered more than when you arrived at a true account of your own actions was what you did after arriving there. He said this and returned to his book, and the conversation was over, which meant it was the kind of conversation that Carlyle was best at, the kind that continued in the other person long after the words had stopped. Edward stayed at the window for a while longer and thought about what it meant to have protected Bella from his own assessment rather than from an actual threat. He thought about the specific mechanism of it, the way he had stood inside his own certainty and looked out at her life and concluded that he knew its correct shape better than she did. He had been doing this, he understood, since before the leaving, had been doing it in smaller ways, throughout their entire time together, reading her through observation and inference and the thoughts of others, rather than through the straightforward practice of asking her what she thought and believing the answer. He had not asked her what she wanted before leaving. He had told himself this was because asking would make it impossible to follow through, that her answer would be what he already knew it would be, and that her answer was wrong, and that a person who knew better than you did what was good for you did not need to ask for your consent to act on that knowledge. This was the sentence he found most difficult to complete honestly, but he completed it. He thought about Jacob Black in this context too, which required a different kind of honesty, the kind that involved acknowledging a debt to someone whose existence generated complicated feelings. Jacob had been there in the months Edward had not been, had been the thing that pulled Bella back from the particular edge she had been approaching, had provided the warmth and presence and ordinary human companionship that Edward had vacated without considering what would fill the space his departure created. He owed Jacob Black something that was genuinely difficult to name, because the thing he owed him was the life of the person Edward loved most, which was not the kind of debt that had a proportional response. You could not balance that ledger. You could only acknowledge that it existed and carry it with the appropriate weight. The jealousy was there alongside the acknowledgement. He did not pretend it was not there, because pretending it was not there was another form of the selective honesty that had gotten him here. He was jealous of Jacob in the specific way of someone who had abdicated a position and discovered that the position had been filled in their absence, that the world had not held itself in suspension, waiting for their return. He was jealous, and the jealousy was irrational in the precise sense of the word. It did not follow from any rational premise that he was entitled to hold, and he knew this, and it persisted anyway, because feelings did not require entitlement to exist. He held the jealousy and the gratitude simultaneously and allowed them to coexist without resolving them into each other, which was the most honest available arrangement. There was something else he returned to repeatedly, a smaller thing that carried a disproportionate weight, the specific content of the lie he had told her in the forest, that she had never been good for him, that what he had felt was not real in the way she had believed it to be real. He had said these things with the deliberate intention of causing her to believe them, and she had believed them, and what the months of his absence had cost her had been paid, at least in part, against the currency of those believed words. He had not told himself, when choosing the lie, that it was anything other than a lie. He had known he was lying, had chosen the lie consciously for the reasons he had outlined to himself. But there was a difference between knowing you are lying and fully reckoning with what a lie does to the person who receives it, and he had not done the second part of that accounting before speaking. She had received those words as fact, had carried them through the months that followed as fact, had built her understanding of what had happened around the factual framework he had handed her, that she had been a temporary interest, that his feelings had not been what they appeared, that the problem was her inadequacy, her unsuitability as a companion for someone like him. He had given her the worst possible interpretation of their time together and had left her to live inside it. He thought about this in the way he thought about the worst things he had done, not with the self-flagellation that could become its own form of avoidance, a way of performing remorse without actually changing, but with the specific attention of someone trying to understand the mechanism of a harm, so that the mechanism could be correctly identified and not repeated. He had caused the harm because he had been more concerned with the effectiveness of the exit than with the truth of what he was leaving behind. He had optimized for clean separation and had treated her experience of the separation as a secondary consideration. Important, but less important than the primary goal of getting far enough away that his own resolution would hold. He had, in the most essential sense, treated his own comfort as a higher priority than her reality, and had done so while telling himself he was performing an act of love. This was the lie he had told himself, not the lie in the forest which had been told to Bella. The lie he had told himself was that his leaving had been for her. It had been for her in part. He believed this. The danger had been real. The concern had been genuine. The love behind the decisions had been as complete as any love he had experienced in his existence. But the leaving had also been for him, had been the action of someone who could not find another way to manage the terror of how much she mattered, who had solved the problem of loving something fragile and mortal and specifically, uniquely threatened by his presence by removing himself from the proximity of that terror. He had left because the fear of losing her had become indistinguishable from the fear of being the cause of losing her, and removing himself had been a way of collapsing those two fears into a single action that felt like resolution. It had not been resolution, it had been displacement. Bella had said nothing to him directly about the content of the months of his absence, about the specific quality of what she had endured. She had not offered testimony or demanded acknowledgement. She was not, he understood, the kind of person who required the person who had hurt her to fully comprehend the extent of the hurt as a condition of moving forward. She was more interested in the moving forward than in the comprehension, which was generous in a way that he found both humbling and faintly alarming. Alarming because generosity extended without requiring understanding did not guarantee that the understanding would be developed, and he needed to develop it. He was developing it. Slowly, honestly, without the comfort of the false clarity that certainty provided. He was learning to hold the full account of what he had done alongside the full account of why he had done it, without allowing either account to cancel the other, without letting the genuine love in his reasons excuse the genuine harm in his actions. He was learning, in the language of Carlyle's oblique observation, the difference between protecting someone and deciding for them. The line between those two things was finer than he had previously believed, and he had crossed it without noticing, because he had not been watching for it, had not believed it was a line he was capable of crossing given how much he cared about the person on the other side. He understood now that caring deeply was not a protection against causing harm. It was, in some configurations, a condition that made harm more likely, that produced the specific kind of damage that only the people who loved you most could reach, the damage that required full trust in order to be possible. He sat with this in the chair in the corner of her room, in the dark, listening to her breathe, and he did not look for the end of the thought or the conclusion that would make it bearable. He let it remain open, unresolved, with all the discomfort of a thing that was true and was going to stay true regardless of what he did next. What he did next would not change what had happened. It would only determine what kind of person he was in the light of what had happened, which was a different and more tractable question. And he knew, with the steadiness of something that had settled rather than been decided, exactly what kind of person he intended to be. The first real conversation happened 4 days after their return from Italy. Not the conversations that had occurred in the immediate aftermath. The necessary exchanges about what had happened, about what the Volturi had said, about the vote and what it meant and what came next. Those had been real in the sense of containing true information, but not real in the deeper sense of two people genuinely present to each other, genuinely receiving what the other was offering rather than managing the surface of an interaction, while the interior remained defended. They had both been too recently through too much for that quality of presence to be available immediately, and Edward had recognized this and had not pressed for it, had given the days after Italy the quality of careful, attentive patience that he was learning. Slowly was more useful than the urgency he had previously brought to most things. The conversation happened in the evening, in the living room of Charlie's house. After Charlie had gone to bed, with the pointed deliberateness of a man who was choosing to extend trust he was not entirely certain was being warranted, whose footsteps on the stairs carried the specific rhythm of someone making their departure known. Edward heard Charlie's thoughts settle gradually from watchful alertness into the lighter concern of someone who had decided to rest and was managing the decision to do so. He heard the moment Charlie's breathing deepened into sleep and registered it as the closing of a door that gave the room below a different quality of privacy. Bella was on the sofa. She had been quiet through the evening in the particular way she was quiet when she was not avoiding something but moving toward it, the quality of someone gathering rather than withholding. He had learned to distinguish between her silences over the months of their time together, to read the different textures of her stillness, and this one had the forward-leaning quality of approach rather than retreat. She said his name, and then she said nothing else for a moment, which was its own kind of sentence. He waited. She asked him, without preamble, and without the softening that might have made the question easier to receive, what he had actually believed would happen when he left. Not what he had hoped, not what he had intended, what he had believed, with the full weight of the word, about what her life would look like in the months that followed his departure. He did not answer immediately. He sat with the question, the way it deserved to be sat with, recognizing it as one of the most honest questions anyone had asked him in a very long time, the kind that required an equally honest answer rather than the version of honesty that selected true things while omitting the ones that complicated a picture. He told her he had believed she would grieve for a defined period and then reorient, that he had believed her capacity for forward motion, which he had observed in other areas of her life, would assert itself in this one, that he had believed, fundamentally, that the life she had before him was sufficiently intact and sufficiently valuable that she would be able to return to it once the immediate pain of the separation had moved through its acute phase. He told her that he had constructed this belief carefully and had not examined it carefully enough, and that the difference between those two things was something he was still sitting with. Bella was quiet for a moment after this. He watched her face and found on it the expression she wore when she was deciding how much of what she was thinking to say. The slight inward focus of someone editing in real time, not to deceive, but to be precise. She said that she wanted him to know what it had actually been like, not to hurt him with it. She was clear about this, her voice carrying the specific quality of someone who has considered their own motives and is being transparent about them. But because she thought he needed to know, in the same way a doctor needed to know the full symptom before they could understand what they were treating. He said that he wanted to know. He meant it completely. She talked for a long time. She talked in the understated way. She talked about things that had cost her significantly, without dramatization, without the performance of emotion that would have made it easier to receive from a distance. She described the first weeks as a kind of absence of interior experience that she had not previously encountered. Not grief in the way she had understood grief from smaller losses, but something more structural, as if the architecture of her daily consciousness had included him as a load-bearing element, and his removal had not left a gap so much as it had left a kind of general instability, nothing quite holding its previous shape. She described the nightmares. She described them briefly and without detail, but she described them, and Edward sat with the knowledge that the dreams she had been having in the months of his absence had been the kind that woke her, that had changed the quality of her nights from the peaceful sleep he had watched over into something she had been managing alone in the dark, and that he had caused this while believing himself to be performing an act of protection. She described the way that doing nothing had been impossible, that she had needed to find something that required enough of her attention to make the interior quiet more bearable, which was how she had begun spending time with Jacob. She described this without apology and without the careful framing that might have suggested she was concerned about his reaction to it, which he noticed and respected. She was not managing his feelings about Jacob, was not softening the account to protect him from the discomfort of hearing it. She was telling him what had happened. She said that Jacob had been the first thing in months that had felt like it was actually happening in the present rather than the past, that being with him had been a form of being alive at a time when being alive had required considerable active effort. Edward listened to this without speaking. He listened to all of it with the quality of attention he was learning to bring to her. Not the processing attention of someone receiving information for later use, not the analytical attention of someone cataloging details, but the simpler and more demanding attention of someone who was simply present for what was being said, allowing it to reach him at full strength without the filtration that made difficult things easier to receive, but also made them smaller than they actually were. When she finished, there was a silence between them that had a different quality than the silence that had preceded her speaking. It was a fuller silence, a silence that contained more than before. Edward sat in it for long enough that she would understand. He wasn't moving past it, but through it, that he was receiving what she had told him with the weight it warranted, rather than the efficiency with which he could have processed it. He told her he was sorry. He said this simply, without the elaboration that might have turned it into a performance of remorse rather than an expression of it. He said he was sorry for the specific things she had described, and he said he was sorry for the belief he had held about how she would respond. The belief that had been built on his assessment of her rather than on her own testimony about herself, which he had never thought to seek before acting. He said that he had made a decision about her life while standing outside of it, which was a position that did not provide accurate information about what a life contained from the inside. Bella looked at him for a long moment. He could not hear her thoughts. He never could, and the impossibility of it had never felt more significant than in moments like this one, when he was being held accountable for the consequences of having made decisions without adequate information, and the person holding him accountable was also the person whose mind remained the only one in his experience that would not give itself to him, that required him to ask and wait and receive rather than simply know. She said that she believed him. She said it with the directness she brought to everything she meant completely, no hedging, no conditional clauses. She believed that he was sorry. She was not saying that being sorry resolved anything, that the account of the months was neutralized by his acknowledgement of it. She was saying that she believed the acknowledgement was genuine, which was the first thing and not the last thing. He told her about the visits. He had not planned to tell her in this conversation, had not determined in advance when or whether to tell her. But the conversation had the quality of a space in which incomplete honesty would be immediately apparent, and he did not want to bring incomplete honesty into this particular space. So he told her that he had come back to Forks during his absence, not to stay, not to reverse the decision, but to stand at the tree line of Charlie's property and listen to the heartbeats inside the house and confirm that she was alive. He told her he had done this more than once, across the months, that the rule he had established about not returning had been the first rule he had broken and had gone on breaking because he had not been capable of maintaining it. He watched her face while he told her this and found on it an expression he had not anticipated and could not immediately interpret. Not anger, though anger would have been entirely appropriate. Not the discomfort of learning she had been observed without her knowledge, though that too would have been warranted. Something more complicated than either, something that sat closer to the expression she had worn in the meadow the previous year, when he had confessed to watching her sleep, and she had told him, with the startling honesty that was so characteristically hers, that she had not minded. She said that she had thought she saw him once, in the early months, standing at the edge of the woods in the grey afternoon light, the kind of half-seeing that she had told herself afterward was grief producing images her mind wanted to find. She said she had thought she was losing her grip on what was real and what was constructed from wanting. He told her that she had not been wrong to see him. She took this in. He watched her take it in, watched the reordering that was happening in her understanding of the months, the recontextualizing of things she had experienced as solitary that were now differently shaped, and he stayed quiet while she worked through it, because some reckonings could not be assisted, could only be witnessed from an appropriate distance. She asked him about Jacob, not with accusation, not with the territorial quality the question might have carried in the other direction. She asked him with the same directness she had applied to everything else in this conversation, as if they had both agreed, without formally agreeing, that this was a conversation in which direct questions were the correct instrument. He told her the truth. He told her that Jacob's presence in her life during the months of his absence was something he was grateful for in the large sense and struggling with in the smaller sense, and that both things were true simultaneously, and he was not trying to resolve one into the other. He told her that what Jacob had done for her during those months constituted a debt he did not know how to adequately acknowledge, and that it sat alongside a jealousy he did not consider himself entitled to, but could not make himself not feel. He said he understood that Jacob loved her. He said the words plainly, without the qualification that might have diminished them, because they were true, and she knew they were true, and pretending otherwise would have been the kind of small dishonesty that contaminated larger conversations. Bella did not respond to this immediately. She looked at him with the specific quality of attention she gave things that mattered, the full focus attention that she had always given him, and that he had always found both precious and frustrating in its unreadability. And he waited. She said that she loved Jacob. She said it with the care of someone who was not trying to wound, but who was not willing to understate what was true in order to protect against the possibility of wounding. She said that she loved him in the specific way she loved him, which was real and which mattered, and which she was not going to pretend was nothing. And she said that it was not the same as what she felt for Edward, that the two things were not in competition for the same space, that comparing them was like comparing two entirely different categories of experience that happened to share a name. She said that she had chosen, that coming to Volterra had been the choice, had been the most complete expression available to her of what she had chosen, and that the choice remained what it had been on that day, regardless of everything that preceded it and everything that would follow. Edward sat with this in the full sense. He sat with the complexity of it. The love for Jacob acknowledged and held, the distinction she was drawing between kinds of love, the choice that she was locating in an action rather than in a declaration, which was entirely consistent with who she was and how she expressed the things she meant most completely. He asked her, and this was the question he had been circling throughout the conversation without quite approaching, whether she trusted him, not whether she loved him, not whether she had chosen him, whether she trusted him specifically after everything that had comprised the last year. She was quiet for long enough that he understood she was not going to answer quickly out of kindness. She said that she was working on it. She said that she trusted his love, trusted that it was genuine and complete and not something she had misread. She said that what she was still reconstructing was the trust that had to do with his judgment, with his decisions about when to act on her behalf and when to defer to her own judgment about her own life. She said that was the thing that had been broken most specifically, and that she was asking him to understand that rebuilding it was going to require him to do something he had historically found difficult, which was to ask her before deciding. He told her that he understood. He told her that he intended to do exactly that, and that he understood the difference between intending it and demonstrating it over time, and that the demonstration was what he was prepared to offer rather than the intention alone. She looked at him for a moment, and then she nodded, once, with the quality of someone making a decision they have been approaching for the length of an entire conversation, and have finally arrived at fully. She said that was enough to start with. He stayed until the early hours of the morning, until the sky outside the windows began its gradual transition from black to the dark grey that preceded the fork's dawn. They talked about smaller things in the hours after the large things had been said. about what graduation would look like, about Alice's already accumulating plans, about the ordinary logistics of a life that was continuing forward into a future that was uncertain in its details, but no longer in its direction. When he left, climbing out the window into the cool, damp air of a Forks morning, he paused for a moment on the branch outside her window and listened to her heartbeat settling back into the rhythm of someone moving towards sleep. Steady, present, entirely real. He had asked her for trust, and she had offered him the beginning of it, which was the only form in which trust that had been broken could honestly be offered. He understood this and received it as what it was, not a full restoration, but a genuine beginning, a foundation that was real precisely because it had not been offered before it was ready. He ran home through the forest with the grey light coming up around him, and the world was loud in the ordinary way of a world full of human minds beginning their days, and beneath the noise of it, at the outermost edge of his range, he could still hear her heartbeat. He carried it with him all the way home. There is a particular kind of knowledge that can only be earned through loss, not the theoretical knowledge of someone who has read about losing, who has observed it in others and catalogued its features with the careful attention of a mind that processes everything it encounters, but the interior knowledge, the kind that settles into the structure of a person rather than sitting on the surface of their understanding, the kind that changes not what you know, but what you are. Edward Cullen had lived for nearly a century before Bella Swan, and in that century, he had learned a great many things. He had learned the mechanics of survival, the discipline of restraint, the long practice of existing alongside humanity without becoming a danger to it. He had learned to be careful, and he had learned to be patient, and he had learned to manage the distance between what he was and what he chose to be with a consistency that he had, at times, confused with wisdom. New Moon taught him the difference. He had left believing he was protecting her. He had returned understanding that the truest protection he could offer was not the removal of himself from her life, but the willingness to remain in it honestly, to ask instead of decide, to trust instead of manage, to accept that her assessment of what she could bear was more reliable than his own, that she had always known herself more accurately than his certainty had allowed her to be known. The absence had cost them both something that could not be fully restored, only honestly acknowledged and carefully built around. The months were real. The nightmares were real. The long, grey Forks days in which she had moved through her own life like a visitor to it were real, and they remained real regardless of what came after. And Edward carried that weight not as punishment, but as information. The most important information available to him about the limits of love that did not include trust. What remained on the other side of all of it was something he had not expected to find. A relationship built on a more honest foundation than the one they had before. One in which she had told him the full truth of what his leaving had cost her, and he had received it without defense. One in which he had told her the full truth of his own failures of reasoning, and she had received it without cruelty. One in which two people had looked at the worst of what they had done to each other and had chosen, with full knowledge rather than innocence, to continue. He was 17 forever. She would not be 18 forever. The asymmetry had not resolved, would never resolve, and all the complications it produced were still ahead of them, patient and inevitable. But she was alive, She was present. She had chosen him across the full distance of what he was and what he had done. And he had chosen her across the full weight of what that choice required him to become. That was enough. That was, in every sense that finally mattered. Everything. So rest now. Let these words dissolve into the quiet. And carry nothing into sleep but this, that even in the longest absence, even in the deepest dark, something worth returning to can remain. Good night.